The pressure had been building for months, increasingly barely perceptible at first. Nobody outside could possibly have imagined the tempest that was brewing silently behind the shut doors of the Brown family. Cody felt he was in charge of all phases of his rigorously built existence: his estate, his money, his persona, even the relationship he kept up with each of the women, to the public. He seemed solid, calm, and unassailable, the patriarch who ruled his household with an iron fist. But off stage, off microphone, off camera, in secret, and in silence, the reality was very different. Hairline cracks had started to form in his immaculately preserved veneer. A bank statement somewhere, a contract somewhere else, tiny inconsistencies that the passing glance would have ignored as mere paperwork. But to Janelle, these fissures were not slight at all. They were the initial indication of a weakness she had long known to be there, but had never been able to reveal. For years, she had kept secretly account of contributions received, funds expended, time spent, and commitments made. She had silently documented everything, knowing that one day the time might come when she would need this record, not for revenge, but for justice, for clarity, for recognition of her efforts. Meri, too, had noticed changes in the atmosphere. Cody's behavior, once predictable and controlled, had begun to waver ever so slightly. Decisions that had once been absolute were now being questioned in private, and the women started to understand that the power they had taken for granted, as always lying in his sole control, may well have been more tenuous than anyone was prepared to consider. The tension was quietly insistent at first, like an electric current flowing beneath the surface of a still lake. But beneath that placidity, a storm was brewing, strengthening with every week. Messages, letters, and indoor talks among the women unveiled a stealthy synchronizing, a strategy unfolding, patient, accurate, and thoughtfully planned. No one beyond the family would ever dream of the scale of what was brewing. The key moment came near unexpectedly. A court document, quiet and unassuming on the surface, was filed into the local records. To the untrained observer, it was merely another legal document, soon to be forgotten. But to those who had been listening, to those who knew the layers of history, of contribution, of control that had characterized this family for decades, it was nothing short of incendiary. The complaint shook years of assumptions, raised the question of fairness in decisions, and reflected back at choices Cody had long believed unassailable. He had thought he had scripted every eventuality, covered every contingency, and dictated every narrative. But in that moment, the myth of complete control started to break down. Each meticulously planned tale, each measured move of kindness, each arranged scene filmed on camera, suddenly seemed subject to interrogation. The women walked into court with quiet resolve. They were serene, unhurried, and yet beneath that facade, there was an air of intent that emanated from them. This wasn't about rage or retribution. It was about responsibility, about making sure that the years of effort they had put in were now going to count. Janelle, with a folder of carefully tabulated proof under her arm, moved with firm determination, her gaze unwavering yet tranquil, taking in the room, noticing every inflection, every response. Meri, at her elbow, was no less poised, her face firm but with unspoken determination. These were women who had been undervalued for years, regarded as backups in a narrative that had long been ruled by Cody's choices, Cody's authority, and Cody's spin. And now, with irrefutable proof, they were going to take back their stories. Cody walked into the courtroom sure of himself, like he always was, ready to have the upper hand. His image in the public eye was one of calm, of authority, of one who had earned the right to make decisions. But within him, a quiet nervousness started creeping in just about as soon as the judge started perusing the documents submitted by Janelle's attorneys. Bank statements kept in careful storage, outdated agreements, letters that had been kept in careful archive. All of it told a story that ran counter to the one he had built so painstakingly. Every document, although subdued and matter-of-fact, held power that could not be discounted. Cody's assurance, once absolute, faltered before the recognition that the authority he had grown so used to was perhaps losing its grip. Robyn, seated in the first row, attempted to compose herself. She smiled publicly, presenting the facade of support for Cody. But those behind the scenes later painted the inner struggle she endured. For years she had assumed the family legacy, their property, and the finances were in support of Cody's choices based on his authority. And now, as the evidence opened itself to her eyes, watching the careful preparation of Janelle and Mary, she experienced the first genuine shudders of doubt. Her own work as mediator, as peacekeeper, was undermined by the hard, irrefutable fact that the women had been quietly recording and preparing all along. In every look shared between them, in every hushed word of consultation, was a turning of the tables, a reassertion of agency long withheld. And as the case unfolded, the courtroom itself became like a stage of revelation. Every document, every bit of evidence, spoke of contribution, of sacrifice, of years poured into a shared dream that had been run, manipulated, and controlled chiefly by Cody. But the women's contributions, years in the making and long unspoken, began to emerge in full light. The judge leaned forward, scanning contracts and statements with increasing interest, nodding every now and then as the story unfolded. Every revelation was a small triumph, a righting of decades-long imbalance, and yet the atmosphere was thick with emotion and expectation. Cody, while keeping his exterior together, could sense the effect. His story, the one he had built and shielded for years, was coming apart. The tension in the courtroom was heavy with emotion. Janelle and Mary, although calm, exuded quiet strength. Their mere presence was a statement, a silent assertion that for years they had been discounted, forgotten, and deprived of credit for their work, their effort, and their insight. Cody's anger grew more obvious at first in subtle gestures, then in harsher, softer mutterings, and later in moments when his public decorum broke down behind the judge's chamber's closed doors. The reality he had long dominated was falling from his grasp, and the stakes were not merely economic. Yes, the courtroom touched on property rights, contributions, and payments, but below it all, it was a fight over agency, over voice, and over visibility. Janelle and Mary weren't simply trying to win in court, they were taking back decades of narrative authority, making the argument that their view, their labor, and their investment counted. Each shred of evidence, each word spoken, was a move to level the balance of a long-tilted family equation. Even as the first day in court finished, the ripple effects were already apparent. Cody's sense of control, the persona he had carefully constructed over decades, was undermined in gentle but inexorable ways. Social media buzz spoke of fans slowly realizing the transition, the delicate shifting of power, the assertive voices that had been silent for much too long. And although the courtroom soap opera itself would go on for weeks, months even, the earliest minutes had established a precedent. The women were set, deliberate, and willing to take their rightful place, legally and emotionally as well, in a narrative that had been so long dominated by Cody's eye. By the end of the first session, the air was electric with expectation. No one outside the family circle could possibly understand the strain, the silent but fierce observing, or the skillful maneuvering that had brought matters to this point. Cody's prerogative, previously unchallenged, met the first serious test of its kind, not in rage or violence, but in preparation, persistence, and unshakable determination. And when Janelle and Mary left the courtroom that day, evidence in hand, the quiet but potent message was unmistakable. The age of unilateral control had ended. The women had started to take back their voice, their efforts, and their place in history. And nothing public opinion, former stories, even decades of entrenched family roles, could do that away with. The courtroom doors swung open with a soft echo that seemed to resonate throughout every part of the room. The air was charged with tension, but an almost unnatural sense of quiet fell over the observers and the players alike. This was not just another procedural day. For decades, decisions had been made behind closed doors. Arguments had been whispered in hallways, and promises had been broken with quiet precision. Now, for the first time, every piece of that hidden history was being brought into the open, illuminated under the stark, impartial gaze of the legal system. Janelle entered first, every step calculated, every movement intentional, as if she carried not only her own body weight, but the accumulated memory of years of monitoring, control, and stoic endurance. Every smile she gave was forced, every movement calculated. To the undiscerning eye, she may have appeared calm, serene even, but those familiar with her past knew that under that tranquil facade was a burning determination that had been fermenting for years. She had mastered patience, strategy, and the secret art of persuasion, and today, all the skills she had mastered were about to be put to the test. Meri arrived next, her entry less showy but no less forceful. Where Janelle wore her confidence on her sleeve, Meri exuded a quiet intensity, a flame that smoldered steadily without blaze. She had waited, observed, suffered through moments that were inconsequential to outsiders, but were intensely meaningful in defining her sense of fairness, respect, and worth. And now, with documentation, proof, and a steadfast conviction of the validity of her work, she had entered a realm where the tide of power was finally shifting. The two women had put up with subtle denials, silent manipulations, and silent assumptions, but every minute's slight had been meticulously documented in accounts, bank records, and computer files. Every piece of evidence was a wordless testament to years of unacknowledged effort, work, and devotion, a work that had long been unappreciated, but would now speak louder than words. Cody walked in with the same confident air he always had, a man used to being the focus of attention, the hub around which every family decision spun. His public demeanor was one of confidence, authority, and calm, but even at the first in the courtroom there was a slight tension that undermined the cracks in that carefully constructed facade. The judge, a seasoned and measured figure, looked briefly at the parties, before giving attention to the documents placed out on the desk. As the opening remarks were made, the muted buzz of expectation seemed to build with each utterance, each gesture, each calculated hesitation. The story was told slowly and methodically. Janelle's lawyers started introducing the evidence, file by file, each more incriminating than the previous. Bank records pointed to monetary donations long overlooked. Emails and texts documented successive attempts at conveying decisions, ideas, and issues, to be greeted by silence or polite dismissal. Hasty scribbled-on notes, kept carefully, documented hours of work, repairs, and outlays devoted to keeping the family properties and sustaining the long term of a shared vision that had always been articulated as Cody's dream. Each bit of evidence was a minor but incontestable challenge to the portrait he had constructed over years, a gradual dismantling of the authority he had thought was absolute. Meri's camp tactically featured her work, playing up the hundreds of hours of property management, repair coordination, and even capital investment as needed. Records, receipts, and documents were carefully paced against timelines, illustrating a pattern of steady engagement and sacrifice. It wasn't confrontation that they wanted. It was acknowledgement, and the subtlety of their tactics made the whole thing even more effective. They weren't shouting or making a big production out of complaints. They were standing quietly on the facts, and the facts were starting to do some explaining that no one could ignore. Cody fidgeted in his chair, small movements revealing the discomfort he was experiencing. The story he had so long choreographed was being rebuilt brick by brick. With each disclosure, pieces of the authority he had exercised were eroded. Each acknowledged contribution from the women, a reminder that control was never one-sided. Silence in the courtroom was broken only by the careful turning of pages, the occasional crinkling of paper, and the measured cadences of legal argument that were more effective than any theatrics could have been. For Cody, the revelation of these facts was not only inconvenient, it was unsettling. He had spent years cultivating an image of clear authority, and now he was faced with a coherently constructed, unchallengeable counter-narrative questioning the very basis of that authority. Robyn, sitting close by, tried to keep her composure. Publicly she was dutiful, sometimes nodding or muttering soft encouragement, but behind the scenes, insiders would come forward to show that she was quietly weighing, taking in the gravity of each revelation, sensing that the dynamic power she had always depended on was changing out from under her feet. The courtroom hearings were laying bare more than accounting discrepancies. They were laying bare the fragile emotional framework that had underpinned this family's apparent cohesion for so many years. And as layer after layer was stripped away, the less obvious, more profound effect became more evident. Witnesses were summoned, some recognizable, others less so, each testifying in a manner that supported the written records. The overall effect, was insidious but unequivocal. The women's long and honored contributions, both tangible and intangible, were being legitimized in a public official setting. With each legitimation, the hidden scales of power began to shift. Cody's responses, while restrained, grew more regular and evident. A slow clench of his jaw, a brief glare, a momentary hesitation in response. These tiny fissures in his demeanor attested to the emotional heft of the proceedings, to the awareness that the story he had so long told was now not his to command. Outside the courtroom, the mood reflected the subdued intensity within. Social media buzz, while still in its early stages at this point in the proceedings, started to suggest movement among public opinion. Supporters and followers guessed, pieced together timelines, and debated what each revelation could signify for the family dynamics. The tension was not only contained inside the walls of law, it was spilling into public awareness, increasing the stakes and piling on the pressure to each choice made inside that room. As the session progressed, it became increasingly clear that the day was not just about financial restitution. It was about recognition, respect and validation for years of often invisible labor. It was about correcting a historical imbalance, acknowledging efforts that had long been overlooked or dismissed. Janelle and Mary weren't just fighting for funds, they were claiming their rights, taking back control, and seeking recognition for decades of personal and monetary investment. And the courtroom, with its formal protocols and unbiased power, offered the ideal platform for this long overdue accounting. By the end of the first day, the quiet but profound pivot was clear. Cody's equanimity, although outwardly preserved, had been tested in ways he had not quite expected. The women had begun to stake their claim, in a systematic and calculated manner, and the implications stretched far from the immediate legal issue. This was not merely about reclaiming a narrative, but rewriting relationships, recalibrating power, and staking claims to authority in a space that had long been held by one person's imagination. As they left the courtroom, Janelle and Mary were outwardly composed, though the stillness of their inner strength was apparent. They had initiated a process that, though hardly finished, had already triggered a chain of changes that would continue to ripple through family life, public attitudes, and the legal saga for months to come. Cody, meanwhile, departed with an analytical step, but an uneasy conscience, conscious of the fact that the ground under his well-laid foundation was crumbling and that the women he had undervalued were silently but resolutely marching to take what was theirs. And even as the doors closed on them, the tale was only just beginning. This session, the first public accounting of years of tension, was merely the start. Each detail, each witness, each piece of paper would continue to erode deeply held assumptions. The power balance had been unsettled, and the reverberations of this day would be felt far beyond the courtroom walls, shaping every interaction, every choice, and every moment to come. The following day, the courtroom was a different place. There was an almost palpable sense of electricity in the air, as though everyone there felt that what had been begun yesterday was just the prelude to a much larger drama. Janelle arrived first once more, her face calm but resolute, as though she had gone into every turn, every question, every obstacle that might face her. She walked as if she had spent decades walking on the choppiest of seas, and come out with the confident deference of having done it before. Each step vibrated with purpose, each look with understanding. She was a mistress of subtle power, and here, now, in this courtroom, that ability would be gauged in the harsh light of law and public scrutiny. Meri trailed behind her, her steps measured but firm. She had dedicated years patiently enduring, often discounted, but recording every concession, every dismissal, every belittled attempt. For decades she had stored away every slight, every insult, every disavowed attempt, cataloging it mentally and physically in notes, diaries and missives. Now, all that diligence was paying off. She did not merely sit by and let these proceedings unfold. She was a live wire, her voice emerging through testimony, her input finally being heard in a manner that mere words could never express. Cody arrived with the same external calm he had maintained for years, but the tension in his eyes belied a seething storm. He had assumed that the courtroom would be a mere formality, a routine process in which his power, his thoughtfully constructed public persona, would go unrebutted. But as the first pieces of paper were placed before him, he sensed that the story he had built up over decades was slipping away from him. His responses, initially subdued, grew more prominent: clenched jaws, a momentary dart of irritation, the hesitant pause before speaking. The meticulously built veneer of authority was starting to crumble, and the women he had discounted were taking it down methodically, bit by calculated bit, with proof that could not be denied. The judge ordered silence, and the hearing began in earnest. Janelle's lawyer started systematically laying out evidence that told a tale far from the one Cody had encouraged for many years. Small donations, frequently minor on their own but considerable as a whole, were exposed. Texts and emails documented numerous attempts at dialogue that had been brushed off or avoided. Photographs, receipts, and letters chronicled years of work, investment, and sacrifice that had existed for years without acknowledgement. Every piece of evidence eroded Cody's account of absolute control and paternalistic guidance, replacing it with an account of cooperation, work, and contributions that had been quietly rejected. Mary's lawyer followed in like manner, pointing out her steady financial investment, her administrative handling of properties, and her hands-on input into family business. Every transaction, every entry, every bank transfer was not merely a figure. It was evidence of dedication, of perseverance, of patience finally rewarded. The courtroom heard a story unfold, one which revealed the hidden framework to years of family life, the unseen work which had been quietly holding together the household and the property Cody was claiming as his own. This was not conflict. It was about recognition, about justice, about recovering a history which had been forgotten. Cody shifted uncomfortably in his seat, slight movements betraying his increasing agitation. He had underestimated the energy of careful documentation, the relentless determination of women who had long been kept on the periphery. The story he had controlled for decades, shaped by his vision and mandate, was being recreated bit by bit, revealing holes in his narrative and shattering assumptions that had long been untested. The courtroom was made into a stage for truth, and the performance that Cody had practiced for years could not hold up to the power of fact, evidence, and meticulously prepared memory. Robyn, seated close by, attempted to keep up a stony facade, emitting periodic murmurs of encouragement, but insiders would later confirm that she was quietly recalculating, keenly aware that the power structure that she had operated under was realigning itself in real time. The hearings in the courtroom were not merely about money. They were revealing the private emotional undercurrents, the unstated grievances, and the finicky illusions that had supported the family's perceived harmony for generations. With each revelation, each supporting witness, each bit of evidence, there were added layers to a story that had been kept out of the public eye, and the balance of influence crept gradually but irreversibly into the defendant's favor. When witnesses were brought in, the narrative grew more complicated and revealing. Former employees, neighbors, and business associates provided accounts of interactions that supported financial donations and worked to preserve family properties. All of the testimony supported the counterintuitive narrative that Janelle and Mary were long-standing equal, if not prevailing, contributors to the family's heritage. Even minor anecdotes, once thought of as irrelevant, became important in context, as they revealed patterns of engagement, initiative, and resilience. Cody's imagined and real control was being systematically tested, and the simmering tension over decades was at last boiling over into hard, uncontestable reality. Outside of the courtroom, excitement and conjecture were building. Social media was already analyzing timelines, connecting evidence, and matching it against what had already been made public on the show. Supporters argued motive, contribution, and fairness, translating public opinion into a second sphere of power. The women's methodical strategy, coupled with unrefutable documentation, sent a wave far beyond the courtroom door. Each disclosure, each verified fact, reinforced the changing balance of power, confronting Cody with not only legal pressure, but public opinion as well. The session also brought out the sophisticated tactics used by the women. Their method was never one of theatrics or public showdown. It was one of precision, of consistency, of quiet strength. Every document, every witness statement, every meticulously kept record, operated as shield and sword alike, exerting influence while keeping voices low. Janelle's serenity, Mary's inner intensity, and the meticulous coordination of evidence bespoke a plan decades in development. Each nuance was important, each bit of detail was meaningful, and the courtroom was the final theater of this long overdue reckoning. Throughout the course of the session, the emotional impact of the proceedings began to reveal itself. Cody, keeping his outward face calm, revealed minute displays of frustration and discomfort. Time that was once passed unseen now seemed to be amplified. Pauses, curt answers, and fleeting moments of remorse. The accretion of evidence, testimony, and procedural stringency was unstoppable. The tale he had orchestrated for so many years was unraveling out of his control. In the meantime, the women's unflinching calmness and painstaking presentation created a shift that was both procedural and symbolic, reconfiguring not only the balance of law, but the emotional topography of the family structure. By day's end, the initial waves of change were apparent. Janelle and Mary had started reclaiming their story, in a public, inarguable manner. Each piece of paper, each witness, each corroborated account, reaffirmed their input and re-established their agency. Cody, perhaps for the first time in years, was faced with the fact that control, influence, and authority were not everlasting, but were earned, sustained, and acknowledged. And at this moment, those constructs had been essentially undermined. The courtroom had become a stage, not only for justice, but for revelation, reconciliation, and transformation. As they exited the room, Janelle's measured gait betrayed control regained, her eyes ahead, unshaken. Meri trailed behind with quiet determination, knowing that the events of the day were just the start of a much bigger story. Cody's step was outwardly consistent, but behind the scenes would come the descriptions of a man struggling with the disturbing discovery that authority could be challenged, confronted, and even redefined. Robyn, continuing to struggle to find her place, came to her own reckoning, discovering that the stability she had been counting on was shifting beneath her feet. And outside the courtroom, all observers, fans, and insiders knew that something was changing in a way that would reverberate through family relationships, public opinion, and the ensuing legal drama for months, perhaps even years to come. The day ended not with closure, but with expectation. Each new disclosure, each new witness, each new piece of information was a strand in a greater fabric of domination, authority, and long overdue acknowledgement. The courtroom had evolved from a location of legal procedure into the stage upon which decades of subterranean striving, silent perseverance, and calculated patience were now being rewarded. And when the doors were closed and the actors left, one thing was sure: the game had been changed, and the narrative was still unfolding. The next day, the air within the courtroom was dense, heavy with expectation and quiet tension. Everyone knew the day's events had a strong possibility of redefining all that had happened before. Janelle was the first to arrive, standing tall with a serene but unyielding demeanor, each movement controlled as if to indicate she had practiced for that day her whole life. Her serenity was not passive. It was a silent exercise of control, an affirmation that she was no longer subject to anyone else's story. The burden of decades of supervision and belittling now squarely fell on the evidence she bore, and the court could feel the change even before a word was uttered. Meri came next in firm resolve. She had spent years in hiding, documenting every slight, every disregarded plea, every personal effort that went unnoticed. Today, all those years of preparation translated into irrefutable evidence, a systematic revelation of the invisible labor and emotional capital she had invested. She wasn't here to settle scores. She was here to be heard, to have the record finally show the reality that had so long been overlooked. Each document, each bank statement, each meticulously saved correspondence now bore a burden that could not be ignored, and she bore it like a shield, prepared to guard the truth. Cody came in with the same outward calm he had spent years building, but those around him sensed faint fissures. His tightly constructed veneer of mastery was starting to crack under the cumulative force of evidence and witness. What had been a simple matter of recounting his own story was now becoming a confrontation with reality, one that underscored the very contributions he had long downplayed or overlooked. He tried to keep his face a mask, but tension radiated, the tiny clenching of his jaw, the slight hesitation before replying, the occasional flicking of his eyes to the lawyer revealed a man who knew he stood to lose, not only a legal fight, but a symbolic one as well. The judge asked the session to commence, and testimony began with the most important witnesses, who had been watching the behind-the-scenes activities of the family for years. The patterns of contribution, control, and effort that had been subtly maintained by Janelle and Mary through the years were revealed in every testimony. Photos, receipts, and text were laid out and indexed, forming a chronological timeline of involvement that did not leave much room for argument. Cody's efforts to push back with his own account came up against the overwhelming evidence of corroboration, and with every minute that ticked by, the court started to tip ever so slightly toward the women's allegations. Janelle's lawyer strategically outlined her financial investments first, tracking payments towards property maintenance, repairs, and collaborative family investments. Each entry, each bank transfer, each signed paper told a story of consistent dedication and unassuming perseverance. What Cody had so long written off as insignificant, negligible, or inconsequential now became the foundation of the family's financial and operational platform. The documentation was more than figures. It was testimony to influence, foresight, and unrecognized work. Mary's lawyer then continued with a similarly compelling argument, highlighting her consistent work in property management, her detail orientation when it came to money, and her role in keeping family properties in place over the course of years. The overall impact of their combined testimony was clear. Cody had asserted control, authority, and ownership for decades, but the women had worked quietly, steadily shaping, holding together, and protecting the very inheritance he now attempted to claim. The courtroom started to resemble less and less a site of objective observation, and more like a stage upon which the story was being reconstructed in the moment. As the testimonies continued, tension reached the breaking point. Cody's answers became more pointed, his efforts at explanation more farcical. He had depended long on perception, on optics of public control, on the deliberate management of his authority in the family. But here, in the light of evidence and systematic analysis, those constructs were disintegrating. The story that had so long cast him as the hub, essential central figure, was systematically being dismantled and replaced by one that recognized the women's contributions, agency, and autonomy. Robyn's presence became increasingly noticeable as the session progressed. Though outwardly calm, insiders would later report that she was quietly resetting, recognizing that her role as the family's stabilizing influence was being challenged. The long-standing belief that loyalty meant control was being undone. With the land gone, the money reallocated, and years of camouflaged contribution made public, the old ways were no longer adequate to keep her in charge. She was seeing a shift in power in motion, and her responses, low-key, taut but evident, added a level of sophistication to the proceedings. The women's strategy was a calculated one and a subtle one. Their tactic was never one of theatrics. It was one of specificity, of conformity to a pattern of unobtrusive authority. Each document, each testimony, each supporting account added up to a narrative that was inexorable in its clarity and inexorable in its emotional force. Janelle's careful calm, Mary's silent perseverance, and the careful laying out of fact made a story that went beyond the courtroom and beyond the immediate legal consequences to the larger tale of justice, acknowledgement, and agency. With each witness, the courtroom was a kind of battlefield, where facts were arsenal and patience was a tactical strength. Witnesses spoke of episodes that attested to years of unheralded labor and silent stamina. Even tiny details, once dismissed or overlooked, took on greater meaning when considered in terms of long-term impact. Cody's efforts to counterattack were confronted with meticulously recorded evidence, and he found himself more and more on the defensive. The courtroom became a stage upon which control, authority, and recognition were being reweighted in the moment. By mid-session, the aggregate weight of evidence had begun to change the emotional dynamics. Janelle and Mary were no longer mere participants, gardeners of the story, exercising influence without confrontation. Cody, for the first time in years, was faced not only with legal woes, but with irrefutable evidence that the story he had long mastered was seeping away from him. Each hesitant answer, each passing moment of doubt, and each evasive eye contact signaled the awareness that decades of presumed dominance were no longer invulnerable. Outside the courtroom, there was anticipation as fans, insiders, and onlookers started piecing together the narrative. Social media thrummed with rumination, timelines rearranged, and public opinion started reflecting the changes in the courtroom. The women's evidence-based, strategic strategy was shaping not only the legal verdict, but the public court of opinion as well. Each document, each witness statement, and each gesture of composed authority helped to weave together a tale much bigger than the courtroom. The meeting concluded with the introduction of the most persuasive evidence, a detailed chronology of investments, contributions, and actions that conclusively illustrated the women's lasting influence and indispensability in preserving family wealth. The papers, tenderly maintained over years, told a story that could not be dismissed. Cody's answers, though on the surface calm, conveyed an increasing realization that control was not complete and authority was not assured. He had been compelled to face the fact that the narrative he had long succeeded in defining and directing was no longer completely his to command. The tension did not abate as the courtroom emptied out. Janelle and Mary departed with calculated assurance, knowing that although the day's hearings were not the last word, they had significantly changed the direction of the case and public opinion. Cody departed with dignity, but sources observed a man struggling with the uneasy awareness that influence, power, and control of narrative were being rewritten. Robyn struggled to integrate the change, silently refiguring her own status and power, aware that the dynamics she had banked upon were shifting out of her control. The day ended not with complete judgment, but with expectation of the ultimate outcome. The foundation had been established, the stories rebuilt, and the balance of power tipped. The courtroom was now a forum not merely for legal persuasion, but for a belated acknowledgement of effort, contribution, and agency. And as the doors closed on the participants, one reality was certain: the narrative had shifted, and those who had long been marginalized were now set to reclaim their place, both legally and in the public's eye. The morning of the final hearing, the mood was nearly dreamlike. The courtroom had cleared, the evidence carefully put before it, and yet, outside the boundaries of the law, the ripple effect was just starting. Janelle moved through empty halls, face serene but firm, as if every step was a declaration of years of endurance and patient planning. It wasn't simply a legal win in terms of papers and signatures. It was a victory for every moment she had patiently stood up for herself, every effort that had long been ignored or belittled. The settlement mattered, but the victory was to reclaim her voice, her agency, and the narrative taken over by others for so long. Meri also brought a humble confidence that could almost be touched. The $35,000 award was an economic jumpstart, but it was also symbolic, a tangible acknowledgement of decades of backroom work, of efforts made behind the scenes, and of the grit she had demonstrated through decades of existence on the periphery of a narrative which never fully included her. Now she could at last enter a life that she owned completely on her own terms. Her business pursuits, her travel, her meticulously crafted social media image, all of it announced a woman no longer waiting for approval, no longer seeking validation, but herself creating her own destiny. Cody and Robyn, on the other hand, were left to deal with the consequences of choices that once had been straightforward. Cody had spent decades constructing a meticulously assembled kingdom of perception, where he called the shots, set the terms, and called the tune. But now that the proof is out in the open, the payments settled, and the women claiming agency, that kingdom felt precarious. Every effort to divert the narrative, to take back control, or to rewrite history, was greeted with the silent but resolute fact that the story no longer curved solely to his desire. His authority, previously taken for granted and well-nigh absolute, was now challenged, recorded and dissected both by insiders and outsiders alike. Robyn's role had also changed. Long held to be the stabilizing influence of the family, she was now forced to grapple with the reality that she could no longer control. The loss of property, the redistribution of money, and the emergence of long-overlooked contributions from Janelle and Mary had broken the foundation upon which she had stood. Her efforts to uphold loyalty and alignment to Cody were confounded by the awareness that the women's new agency was not an interim disruption, it was here to stay. In the background, she reset, trying damage control while secretly grappling with loss of influence and the realigned power dynamic she had previously taken for granted. As weeks turned into days, the public response became inescapable. Social media buzzed with debate, side-by-side comparisons, and analysis of the unfolding transition. Fans dissected prior installments, stringing together clues of contributions overlooked and choices made in favor of Cody's domination of collaborative input. The communal examination added a new dimension of accountability beyond that of the courtroom. It wasn't about dollars or land anymore. It was about respect, recognition, and the ability to assert a personal story without interference. Janelle's steady temperament and patient strategy continued to color the perception of her victory. She did not gloat, did not attack, did not try to humiliate. Her deliberate demeanor enabled the world to see a woman who had built her case quietly, asserted her rights, and walked away with dignity unscathed. Each appearance, each tweet, and each managed encounter served to reinforce the message that she was no longer beholden to anyone else's narrative. Her karma line, previously thought of as poetic, now had a real, almost material weight. It was the articulation of a confidence from preparation, persistence, and the quiet accrual of leverage that had been so long neglected. Mary's transformation was the same as Janelle's, but in a voice all her own. The $35,000 was only the start. Her confidence was expressed in her travel blogs, her entrepreneurial pursuits, and even in her social behaviors. What was once caution and hesitancy became boldness and intention. She had learned that respect and acknowledgement were not to be waited for. They were to be taken. The principles of patience, persistence, and calculated restraint had all built to a moment of self-enfranchisement, and she took it completely. Cody, on the other hand, started looking into new initiatives in a bid to regain timeliness. Whispers of a men's empowerment retreat emerged, billed as a safe space for men to work through divorce, blended families, and media criticism. But the optics were wrong. The public had seen him lose all but almost everything: the land, the power, the narrative he so painstakingly guarded. His own efforts at reinvention were filtered through recent failure, painting the retreat as less about counsel and more about repairing a broken image. The irony was thick. While the women were constructing legacies founded on independence and ownership, Cody's vision was based on taking back control from others who had already moved beyond him. The women's strategic patience stretched beyond short-term financial rewards. Planning on possible collaborations, books, or media productions, disclosed that they weren't responding out of anger only. They were creating a future where their lives, their voices, and their visions were the focal point. A shared book, a survival map and empowerment guidebook, was mentioned as a possible prospect. It was not about revenge. It was about education, advice, and a declaration of survival and empowerment. The public, who were once the audience for drama, were now the witnesses to a peaceful revolution of individual power that would redefine stories for years to come. Within the family, within relationships, dynamics changed. Cody's efforts to hold sway were increasingly met with implicit but firm counter-resistance. Women's empowerment defied notions of loyalty, authority, and control permanence. Robyn, trying to serve as an intermediary or defend the family's reputation, grappled to find accommodation within shifting, irreversible dynamics. The internalized psychological environment transitioned from an environment of presumed hierarchy to one of complicated negotiation, agency, and personal empowerment. As the last of the legal papers were signed, and the land was transferred, the symbolic implications could not be overestimated. The redistribution was not just a deal, It was an acknowledgement of worth, work, and recognition that had been overdue for decades. Janelle and Mary's triumphs were not boisterous, dramatic, or performative. They were intentional, systematic, and based on facts. The gentle assertion of rights, the meticulous safeguarding of evidence, and the unshakable patience all led to a conclusion that reaffirmed their autonomy and agency. Christine, however, having departed early from the family drama, watched the developments from a position of security and self-satisfaction. Her premature exit and later autonomy now made her an exemplar of autonomy. She was inspiration and affirmation for Janelle and Mary, displaying the real-world results of taking back agency prior to pressure from outside compelling the confrontation. Her presence, distant from the courtroom, emphasized the abiding principle that self-governance, anticipation, and self-initiated action were stronger than fleeting coalitions or delayed acknowledgement. In the public eye, responses coalesced around the adoration of the women and distrust of Cody and Robyn. The story had irretrievably changed. The former patriarchal organization was replaced by one of empowerment, acknowledgement, and the meticulous recovery of individual agency. Social media discussion, fan analysis, and insider journalism all contributed to the feeling that the women had been able to redefine not only the legal outcome but the emotional and cultural sense of the family's dynamics. By the end of the month, the change was palpable. Janelle was aggressively working on personal ventures and property development in her own name. Meri was increasing her business presence and travel enterprises, and Christine continued to be a beacon of foresight and freedom. Cody's rebranding and authority restoration attempts were continuous, but increasingly regarded as backpedaling instead of forward thinking. Robyn, operating in a terrain she no longer completely dominated, confronted the emotional and symbolic implications of a changed locus of power. In the end, the Coyote Pass narrative came to its conclusion not solely by dollars, acreage, or judicial decision. It was concluded by acknowledgement, autonomy, and the recovery of stories long denied. The women had departed more affluent, not merely financially but emotionally, tactically, and culturally. They had shown that patience, preparation, and unassuming perseverance could reverse entrenched hierarchies, and that real influence was not necessarily about control but the capacity to hold one's ground and keep integrity intact during the process. The narrative ended not in bravado, but in change. The land once representative of control became a stage upon which empowerment occurred. The payouts, once considered to be representative of division, were now indicators of accomplishment and recognition. And the women who were once forced into secondary roles became their own architects of their futures. Cody and Robyn, forced to answer for years of assumption of power, were left to come to terms with a reality they could no longer control. The transformation was deep, lasting, and irretrievable. The women had won, unobtrusively, overwhelmingly, and outrightly on their own terms, leaving a legacy of determination, prudence, and empowerment that would echo long after the cameras had ceased to roll.